They called him many things: gangster, businessman, politician, a man who built an empire from the ashes of war. But before the power, before the respect, before the name Shelby carried weight, he was just a soldier. A soldier who had seen hell, lived through it, and returned with a fire inside him that would never burn out. Thomas Shelby was not born into wealth. He was not handed a silver spoon. No, he came from the dirt, from the factories of Birmingham, from a family that was barely scraping by. The streets were his education. The hunger in his stomach was his first lesson. And the war was his teacher, a cruel, merciless teacher that stripped him of his innocence and left behind something far more dangerous: a man with nothing to lose. When he came back from the trenches, the world had changed, but so had he. The Thomas Shelby who had left Birmingham was not the same man who returned. The old world no longer fit him. He wasn't content with being another man in the slums, another worker breaking his back for a few scraps. He had seen death. He had played cards with the devil and survived. And he knew that fear was just a weapon. Either you held it or it was used against you. So he chose to rise, not by luck, not by favors, but by intelligence, by strategy, by an unshakable belief that no one, no king, no government, no banker was above him. And when the time came, when the right opportunity presented itself, he would take what was his. Because Thomas Shelby didn't just dream of power, he was made for it. Thomas Shelby never rushed, he never acted out of impulse. Every move he made was like a piece on a chessboard, precise, deliberate, and ruthless. He understood something most men never did: power wasn't about who pulled the trigger first. It was about who controlled the game before the gun was even drawn. And the game he was about to play, it wasn't on the streets anymore. It wasn't in the dark alleys of Birmingham where razor blades settled disputes and fear ruled the weak. No, this was a different battlefield. A battlefield where the weapons weren't bullets but numbers, where the currency wasn't blood but wealth, and where the real kings didn't carry guns, they carried banks. Thomas Shelby had conquered the underworld, but now he was going for something bigger, something untouchable. He had studied them, the bankers, the aristocrats, the men in tailored suits who thought they were untouchable, and he understood their greatest weakness. They weren't afraid of gangsters. They weren't afraid of violence. What they feared was something far worse: a man like them, but smarter, hungrier, and willing to burn their world to the ground if necessary. So he played the long game. He built wealth the way he had built his empire, with strategy, patience, and an iron will. He invested in racehorses and exports, in deals that others wouldn't dare touch. And when the moment was right, when the city was looking in another direction, when the bankers were sipping their expensive whiskey, laughing in their private rooms, thinking they were safe, Thomas Shelby made his move. He didn't walk into that bank with a gun. He didn't need to. He walked in with a check, with money, with power. And when the man behind the desk looked up, ready to turn him away, ready to dismiss him like just another lowlife from Birmingham, Thomas smiled. A slow, knowing smile. Because that man had no idea, he no longer owned his own bank. Thomas Shelby did. Power, it's a funny thing: some men inherit it, others steal it, but the rarest kind, the men who build it from nothing. Thomas Shelby was one of those men. Owning a bank wasn't about money, it wasn't about gold or numbers on a piece of paper. No, this was about something much deeper: control. The kind of control that whispered through the corridors of power, the kind of control that could ruin a man's life with a stroke of a pen. And that was exactly what he intended to do. You see, this bank wasn't just any bank. It was the financial heart of the same people who had once looked down on him, the people who had dismissed him, spat on his family's name, and thought he would always remain beneath them. The people who believed wealth was their birthright and power was something only their kind could hold. They were about to learn a lesson. Thomas didn't buy the bank to make money, he bought it to make a statement, a warning, a weapon. He went through the ledgers, the accounts, the debts, and soon the names started appearing: the men who owed money, the men who had taken loans, the men who had built their castles on borrowed fortunes, and that was when Thomas smiled. Because now they didn't just owe money to a bank. They owed him. He called them in one by one. Aristocrats, politicians, men in polished suits who had never feared anything in their lives, until now. Until they sat across from him and saw it: the cold, calculating look in his eyes, the look of a man who didn't bluff, the look of a man who had spent his life watching others suffer and had no problem returning the favor. Some begged, some threatened, some tried to reason with him, but Thomas Shelby wasn't in the business of mercy. He was in the business of power. And by the time they walked out of his office, they knew the truth. They had spent their whole lives believing money protected them. Now money was the very thing destroying them. They thought power came from privilege, from old money, from family names written in history books. They were wrong. Power came from knowing when to strike, and Thomas Shelby, he had been sharpening his blade for years. The men who owed him, the lords, the politicians, the so-called elite, they had spent their lives untouched by consequence. They had ruined families with the flick of a pen, sent men to war for profit, built their fortunes on the backs of the desperate. And now, for the first time in their lives, they were the ones in danger. They whispered in their clubs, they met in secret, sipping expensive whiskey with shaking hands. Thomas Shelby was too dangerous, they said, too ambitious. He had crossed a line, stepped into a world that was never meant for men like him. And so they plotted. A banker he had humiliated, a politician he had outmaneuvered, a nobleman whose father had once ruled Birmingham like a king. They had money, they had connections, and they had the one thing men in fear always turn to: desperation. They tried to have him killed. A bullet in the dark, a hired gun paid well to end the rise of Thomas Shelby. But Thomas had survived war. He had looked death in the eye and walked away every time. A nameless assassin wasn't going to change that. The attempt failed, and that was their biggest mistake, because now it wasn't about business anymore. Now it was about revenge. And when Thomas Shelby came for revenge, he didn't come with anger, he didn't come with reckless violence, no, he came with strategy. One by one, he dismantled them. The banker, bankrupt overnight; the politician, exposed for corruption, ruined beyond repair; the nobleman, a scandal so brutal his family name was wiped from history. And when it was all over, when the dust had settled, when the men who once ruled had been reduced to shadows of themselves, Thomas Shelby walked into that same bank, his bank, and poured himself a drink. Because he had won. Not with guns, not with threats, but with intelligence, with patience, with an understanding that the most dangerous man in any room is the one who can burn you down without ever raising his voice. Power. It had always been an illusion, a trick played by those who held it to make others believe it was out of reach. But Thomas Shelby, he had shattered that illusion. He had risen from nothing. He had outplayed the lords, the politicians, the men in suits who thought they were untouchable. He had taken their wealth, their influence, their very sense of security, and turned it into his weapon. And now, as he stood in the grand office of the bank he had once been refused entry to, he knew the truth. He didn't just own a bank. He owned the men who needed it. They had called him a gangster, a thug, a man who didn't belong in their world, but now they sat at his table, they listened when he spoke, they feared what he might do next. And yet, for all his victories, for all his power, there was something else, something deeper. An emptiness. Because power in the end was not an endgame, it was a cycle, and once you had it, you could never let go. The enemies would never stop coming, the betrayals would never cease. He had won the war, but the battlefield would never disappear. So he poured himself a glass of whiskey, took a slow sip, looked out over the city that was now his. And he smiled. Because Thomas Shelby understood what they never could. You don't need a crown to be a king. You just need to be the last man standing. And that, my friends, is the legend of Thomas Shelby, a man who didn't just play the game, he rewrote the rules. He proved that true power isn't given, it's taken, not with bullets but with intelligence, not with fear but with control. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more legendary tales of power, success, and the minds that shaped history, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. More stories are coming your way, stories that will inspire, motivate, and maybe even change the way you see the world. Until next time, stay sharp and remember, fortune favors the bold.